Bardia, Libya. January 1941. A tank sits alone in the sand, engine dead, hatch open, no crew inside. Its hull is scarred with 11 strike marks. 11 hits from a 47mm anti-tank gun fired from under 500 meters by gunners who had trained for this exact moment. Not one round went through. An Italian ordnance officer walks up, runs his hand along the armor plate, and finds it barely dented. Within 6 months, Rome's own steelworks will admit in writing that they cannot replicate what's sitting in that sand. This is the story of how one abandoned tank told Italy it was already losing a war it had barely started. This isn't a story about a battle. Nobody died taking this tank. It was found empty, its crew already evacuated after a mechanical fault north of the perimeter wire. But what happened next, in a technical shed outside Tripoli, mattered more than most of the fighting that January. The tank was a Matilda II, 26.5 tons, built by the Vulcan Foundry and the London, Midland and Scottish Railway Works, armed with a 2-pounder gun that nobody in North Africa was particularly afraid of. What frightened the Italian 10th Army wasn't the gun. It was the fact that their own anti-tank guns, the standard 47-32, could not stop it. Not at any range they'd tried. By the time this specific tank reached the technical depot at Tripoli, Italian officers had already filed a dozen reports from the front, all saying variations of the same thing. Rounds bouncing, rounds cracking, rounds failing to penetrate. Command wanted to know why, so they sent for the one man in North Africa who could actually answer that question with a caliper and a metallurgy textbook instead of a guess. His name was Colonnello Renato Vassalli, an ordnance engineer attached to the Radio Esercito's technical services on loan from the armor testing programs back in Italy. He'd spent the 1930s around Ansaldo's proving grounds, testing Italian plate against Italian shells. He knew exactly what a 47-32 round should do to 20mm of face-hardened steel. He'd never seen one fail to do it 11 times in a row. Vassalli's team pulled the Matilda into a corrugated iron shed at the depot, chalked a grid over the hull, and started with the simplest possible question. How thick is this metal, actually? They took calipers to the front glasses and got a reading of 78mm. Then they measured the turret front and got 75. For comparison, the standard German Panzer III running in the desert that same month carried 30mm on its front hull. The Matilda was carrying more than double the armor of the tank the Italians considered their most dangerous opponent, on a machine nobody in Rome had rated as a serious threat. One of Vassalli's junior officers, a lieutenant named Aldo Ferrero, wrote in his notebook that night, "The numbers do not match the intelligence file." He underlined it twice. Ferrero had read the pre-war assessments of British armor. Every one of them was wrong. If you're the kind of person who wants the real numbers behind the machines that decided this war, not the version that gets flattened into a textbook paragraph, that's exactly what this channel does every week. Hit subscribe and you won't miss the next one. The war didn't pause for Vassalli's measurements. That same week, 300 miles east, the Australian 6th Division was closing on Tobruk, and the Italian garrison there was digging in behind the same anti-tank guns that had just failed against the tank sitting in his shed. Every hour his team spent measuring was an hour those gunners spent trusting equipment that didn't work. Layer 2 started with the strike marks themselves. Vassalli had his men Section 1, cutting a wedge out of the armor around an impact point where a 47mm round had hit and failed to penetrate. Under a hand lens, the shell hadn't just failed, it had shattered. The plate wasn't simple rolled homogeneous steel, the kind Italian factories at Terni were producing. It was face-hardened. The outer layer had been treated to a hardness that fractured incoming projectiles on contact, while the inner layer stayed softer and more elastic, absorbing the shock instead of cracking. Two different material properties in one plate, blended at the boundary rather than bolted together. Ferrero later described the moment they identified this as the point Vassalli stopped talking for almost a full minute. He simply looked at the sectioned steel, turned it over once, and set it down. Then he said, to nobody in particular, "They hardened it exactly where we harden ours, and somehow made the back half stronger anyway." Face hardening wasn't new. Italian naval armor used a version of it, but naval plate was cast in massive slabs for battleships, produced in small quantities by specialists. What Vassalli was holding had come off a tank built in a British locomotive works, rolled and treated at a rate the Italians associated with mass production, not battleship armor. That was the part that didn't add up yet. A British tea urn, half a world away at the Vulcan foundry in Lancashire, kept the shift workers who rolled this exact grade of steel supplied around the clock, on a production line that had no idea an Italian colonel was about to spend a week trying to reverse engineer their process. Layer 3 took Vassalli's team to Terni. Weeks later, once samples had been shipped back to Italy. Terni was the country's premier armor steel producer, the plant that supplied plate for the Regia Marina's cruisers. If anyone in Italy could replicate British face hardening, it would be the metallurgists there. They ran a full composition analysis. The British plate carried nickel and chromium in specific proportions, alongside molybdenum, a metal Italy imported almost entirely from abroad because it had no significant domestic reserve of it. The nickel content alone came in higher than what Terni typically specified for naval-grade cemented armor. Applied here to a plate a fraction of the thickness, on a vehicle built for a mobile war rather than a fixed gun turret. The Terni metallurgists wrote back to the Ordnance Department with a specific admission. Duplicating this composition at the volumes needed to armor a tank fleet would require molybdenum imports Italy could not secure under wartime conditions. And even with the raw material, matching the exact hardening gradient the British had achieved would need furnace and quenching equipment the plant did not currently operate. Vassalli read that letter standing in his office in Tripoli, according to Ferrero's account, and set it on his desk without comment. Then he opened the drawer, took out the file on the Matilda, and added a single line to the cover in pencil. "This is not a tank we can copy. This is a supply chain we do not have." While that letter sat on Vassalli's desk, 400 miles south, Italian infantry divisions were preparing to abandon positions along the coast road, falling back toward El Agheila, in retreat from an offensive that had started, in part, because British armor kept surviving contact that should have destroyed it. Layer 4 moved inside the hull. Vassalli's team pulled the engine deck and found two AEC diesel units, coupled together, producing a combined 95 horsepower. That number looked unimpressive on paper, low compared to Italian tank engines of similar weight class. But diesel meant something specific in a desert campaign. Fuel that didn't ignite as easily under fire, and an engine that ran cooler in ambient heat that regularly passed 45 degrees Celsius. More importantly, they found the transmission was a British Wilson pre-selector gearbox, a design that let a driver change gears without depressing a clutch pedal, using a small lever and a foot pedal that engaged the selected gear cleanly. Italian tank crews trained for months to manage crash gearboxes smoothly under combat stress. A Matilda driver could be trained to a competent standard in a fraction of that time. Ferrero's notebook records a junior mechanic, a corporal whose name didn't make it into the official report, sitting in the driver's position for nearly 20 minutes, working the gear lever back and forth with the engine off, saying almost nothing. When he finally climbed out, he told Ferrero it felt like driving a delivery truck, not a battle tank. He meant it as the highest compliment he had. This mattered more than it sounds. It meant Britain could put a reasonably competent crew behind this armour faster than Italy, could train crews for its own thinner-skinned vehicles. The advantage wasn't just the steel. It was how quickly ordinary men could be turned into men who could fight from inside it. Layer 5, the one that turned this from a technical curiosity into a crisis, came from the welding seams. Vassalli had a section cut through the hull joint between the glacis plate and the sponson. Italian construction at the time relied heavily on riveted armour, a method that left the hull vulnerable at every seam, because a hit near a rivet line could shear rivet heads into the crew compartment as secondary shrapnel, even if the round itself never penetrated. The Matilda's hull was welded, not riveted, at every major joint Vassalli's team examined. No rivet lines, no shear points. A round that failed to penetrate the plate simply failed, full stop, without turning the tank's own construction into a weapon against its crew. Vassalli dictated a line to Ferrero for the final report that his lieutenant later called the only sentence in the entire document that sounded like it came from a man, not an engineer. Their tank protects the men inside it from itself. Ours does not. It's worth sitting with what that sentence actually meant. Italian tank crews weren't just facing better armoured opponents. Some of them were being hurt by their own vehicle's construction the moment an enemy round landed anywhere near a seam, regardless of whether it penetrated. That same week, medical officers at the base hospital in Tripoli were logging exactly this pattern of wound. Crewmen struck by fragments inside their own tanks, from hits that hadn't broken through the armour at all. Vassalli's report reached the technical command roughly the same time those hospital logs did. Nobody had connected the two until his team laid the welded seam next to the riveted one and made the comparison explicit. The sixth and final layer was the shortest examination, but the one that settled the matter completely. Vassalli's team weighed the tank, section by section, against the total combat load it carried, and compared that figure to what Italian industry actually had the capacity to produce in tonnage of specialty alloy steel per month across every plant in the country. The number Turney had given him for monthly output of comparable armour-grade steel, even running at full wartime capacity, wouldn't cover a single armoured division equipped to this standard. Britain was building tanks like this one at a pace Italian industry couldn't match, even in theory, not because of a shortage of factories, but because of a shortage of the specific raw materials those factories needed. Here is what the entire examination came down to. Italy could copy the shape of the tank. Italy could copy the gun mount, the tracks, even the general silhouette, given enough time and enough captured examples to study. What Italy could not copy was the steel, not the design of it, the supply of it. Molybdenum came almost entirely from mines Italy did not control. Nickel, in the quantities this armour needed, ran through supply lines the Regia Marina was already fighting the Royal Navy to keep open in the Mediterranean for its own ships, let alone spare tonnage for army tanks. And the specific quench and temper process that gave this plate its hardened outer skin and elastic inner core required furnace capacity Turney had never built. Because before this war, nobody in Italy needed to build tanks that could shrug off their own best anti-tank gun. Colonnello Vassalli's final written conclusion, submitted to the technical command in Rome in the spring of 1941, said this: any attempt to match this armour standard across a production fleet would fail, not from lack of engineering skill, but from lack of the specific materials required. Materials Italy could neither mine nor reliably import for the duration of the conflict. Rome's response was to shift Italian anti-tank doctrine almost entirely. Field commanders in North Africa were told, within months, to stop relying on the 47/32 as a primary tank killer and to lean instead on the 90mm anti-aircraft gun, repurposed for direct fire against armor, because it was one of the only weapons in the Italian arsenal that could reliably punch through plate, like the one sitting in Vassalli's shed. That single technical shift, born from measuring one abandoned tank, changed how Italian gunners fought for the rest of the Desert War. That Matilda never fired another shot after it was recovered. It sat in a technical depot, was catalogued, photographed from every angle Vassalli's team could manage, and eventually its turret and hull went their separate ways into storage as the North African campaign shifted west, past Tripoli, past the depot itself. Pieces of Matilda II tanks from this same campaign sit today in collections in Britain, in Egypt, in Australia, catalogued as one of dozens of surviving examples of a tank most visitors walk past without reading the placard closely. It's not the most famous tank of the war. It doesn't have the silhouette people recognize, the way they recognize a Tiger or a Sherman. What most visitors don't know, standing in front of one, is that a single example of this machine, found empty in the sand outside Bardia, told an entire nation's steel industry exactly where its war-making capacity would fail, months before that failure showed up on any battlefield. Vassalli's report didn't stop a single tank from rolling off a British production line. It just told Rome, in writing, that it could never build enough of its own to match them. The tank in that shed never won a battle. It won an argument nobody in Rome wanted to have with itself about what the country could and couldn't build. And by the time the argument was settled, the war had already moved on without waiting for an answer.